Hello everyone, today we compare two of the three major trade hubs in Europe in the second half of the 14th century, namely Germany and Italy in their respective Baltic and Mediterranean markets. So we are mostly looking at Lübeck and Genoa compared just for the sake of quantity there because we are informed um, well enough about it, but then we will also concentrate on the broader economy of specifically southern Germany, Lombardy, and Tuscany, because quite interesting things start happening here. I created recently a medieval economy playlist where you can find all this themed topic content. You have already seen essentially what are the major dynamics in this century, right? Not just the big crisis of the 14th century, but also an important trade route shift in Europe that start privileging some areas rather than others, right? The Hanseatic League is strong at this point, but is still suffers some blows also because towards the late Middle Ages, both the German principalities and the Scandinavian monarchies reinforced, and so they gradually, in spite of the still, important capacities against, especially the Scandinavian monarchies, the Hanseatic League reduces her political power, let's say. Equally, Genoa, that is gradually ousted from most of the trade with the Levant by the Venetian-Aragonese alliance. The general crisis of the also of the Rhone route that had connected Tuscany via, in fact, Genoa and the Rhone Valley with the Champagne fairs, and France is engulfed in the 100 Years' War, so with the English chevauchée, the entire region is disrupted. On the other hand, Genoa does maintain important posts up to the Don, a river in Crimea, etc. It's just a reduction of traffic, not really a disappearance from the east. But also, they open the Atlantic route, and as we've seen also recently in a video about 14th century Portugal, this is how essentially the Iberian monarchies, but through Italian navies, began to explore, probably start the age of exploration. At the same time, Venice opens a continental route because she had also in part exploited the French direction, and so Bavaria also increases in importance consequently. Tuscany suffers a bit more of a crisis for reasons that we will explain now, because a mere economic history doesn't tell the whole story, as a matter of fact. There are, as you understand, important political and military issues. Tuscany remains more politically fragmented compared to Lombardy, that instead expands, becomes much more of a state under the Visconti, and as you know, the place was already the seat of essentially the most important armory industry in Europe. And there is definitely a divide also between northern and southern Germany, that aside, in fact, from the Hanseatic League, that it is essentially a maritime power, right? It doesn't have really much of an hinterland per se, like eventually instead, like even Genoa had by a degree, Venice would acquire to an important scale in the 15th century in northeastern Italy. And the northern principalities of Germany, the territorial ones, are instead poorer just than the south. Right, the Rhineland is important, but in general, areas like Bavaria, Austria, and we discussed them last year and one before, looking a bit at the phase of princely Germany, the post-Hohenstaufen and Interregnum phase, the rise of the Habsburgs, of the Wittelsbach. So these are southern German powers. Of course, they're not the only ones, but they become more important, and with also more ties with the same Italy, and as we will see, this will be very important commercially speaking, are the ones reigning over the richest lands in the south of Germany. And this cultural divide was, as we've seen also in other videos, for example, about the German mercenaries in the same Italy during the 14th century. I like the fact that we start having lot of videos that you can check as from different perspectives, like economical, social, military, political, etc. It does cause conflict, siding, etc. So you know that I'm not an historical materialist. I also am not particularly sympathetic to just economic, at least people who pick economy per se as just the deal, right? So I realize that whenever I search here and there for making these videos, that of course there is a benefit deriving from having different perspectives at the same point, because normally the economy historian mostly focuses just on that. It doesn't care so much about the local political events, even when they are even of obvious relevance, right? But never underestimate how much hyper specialization can damage us in historiographical interpretation. So I privilege, as you know, political and military history in my videos, and I always try to draw the parallels because they're obvious, right? Today I will not digress on the method I use and what kind of philosophy of history I have, but the more I studied, and the more I realized that everything, like if there is a dynamic, it manifests itself at every level, right? You can't say, economically speaking, there is one thing, and politically something that is unrelated to it, right? They're always the same thing, but let's say economy is not just even the most important thing, just a part of society that is all one with politics and also with war. And if one categorizes too much, it's not going to end particularly well. So it's important also to look at this different regions of Europe, not just because of the importance in commercial development. At this point, made a video a couple of years ago about the development of European banking in late medieval Europe. Naturally, the Italians, but also at least the Germans in the 15th century especially. So today we do not look at that, but we're still in the second half of the previous century. Are really advanced, right? The other region we actually leave out today is Flanders, right? Or also the Netherlands, if you want to stress the fact that eventually there was a shift, as you know, during the Middle Ages from cities like Ghent, Brugge, Ypres, and towards Antwerp and Amsterdam and so on. So that prefigures other late medieval and especially early modern dynamics. But looking, in my opinion, about at the Baltic and say the Mediterranean was monopolized, commercially speaking, by the Italians. So by approximation, except for Aragon, that in fact Catalonia, specifically with Barcelona, we look at substantially a maritime dominated area, mostly by the Italians, and naturally Venice and Genoa, right? So we'll talk more about also Barcelona at some point, because it really, during the 13th to 14th century, as you know, it starts becoming properly the major power in Mediterranean, seizing also parts of southern Italy, as you know, and even paving the way for the broader Spanish hegemony over the peninsula in the early modern age. But that's also, in fact, another story. We concentrate really on this mostly German and Italian background. So, first of all, what can we say? That I'm not completely updated on the whole historiography, and I presume that there is a very advanced and fast-paced kind of structured systemic information about broader comparisons that have been done, etc. But at the same time, with the Middle Ages, it's always a bit the same problem. Lack for most realities some satisfactory information. So we know, for example, we will see now, enough about Lübeck and Genoa to confront some data. If some other ports were less important, we may simply not know, right? Or maybe there are some important ones, but that do not have the same documentation, either by accident, like maybe archives went destroyed, or a different institutional development that didn't produce enough sources. In any case, we can roughly dimension what was Baltic and Mediterranean trade comparatively at this point. Lübeck, as you know, is fairly enough, right, and also uncontrovertibly, I believe, the most important Hanseatic trading city. Still at this point, it was essentially the founding one. It's a beautiful place to visit, and you can really breathe that kind of independent spirit that these towns really had, seafaring, but also aggressive kind of policy, very, very commercially oriented, as you understand. From here, we have Genoa, that is properly a city-state. Right, today we talk just about trade, so it's obvious that there is a massive difference, as we will see, that is paralleled, in fact, as I was just saying before, also by the economic scale between these powers, right? City-states had, first of all, there were bigger cities in the first place. Even during this period that, as you know, was affected by the plague, the demographic drop, and of which Italy suffers particularly exactly because of this dramatic demographic concentration, especially in the cities that were as populated as the countryside. And before that, say literally 1/4 of the Europeans was Italian. Things start shifting a bit at this point, also in economic favor. We've seen it often that in the broader millennium, you see that of the Middle Ages, Southern Europe is by far, right, richer and more populated, and it keeps growing. Of course, during the Middle Ages is a dramatically expansive period, but in comparison, even though Northern Europe is in fact poorer and less populated, there is in relative terms a greater increase, right? And Germany, especially by the 13th, 14th century, has reached Italy in population, right? And Germany naturally was very composite, as you know. It encompassed, in fact, an enormous amount of lands that barely have anything in common with each other. I mean, think about Frisia with Styria, the latter of which we made a video for the historical region series, from Brandenburg to Switzerland. So again, surely interconnected areas, also with other areas of Europe, just like today's video shows. It was a major landmass, right? And there were interesting dynamics that at some point we have traced, most of our military history accordingly, but that we will have to look at properly from a more demographic, social point of view in Germany. It goes without saying that the Genoese evidence is much larger, right? It's even though Genoa is not as politically and institutionally structured as Venice, it's basically become, by this point, as big, even probably surpassing the same Venice in trade, right? And it would eventually decline exactly because of her lesser political cohesion, by just saying the importance of unity, even when you have resources that can come to challenge even the same Venice. With the War of Chioggia, for example, that risk literally to be knocked out by the Ligurian arrival. From the 14th century, there are custom figures for 1334 Genoa, and then for 46 years between 1341 and 1406 Genoa. So it's a lot of stuff, right? Italian archives are, magnificent and still at this point in history largely unexplored because of reasons now I can't not digress on. Mostly the lack of essentially of a monarchy, right? Of a state like, for example, I don't know, Aragon, the Crown of Aragon developing like the Iberian monarchies much earlier, kind of more centralized structure. These were city-states, but still, in fact, very much individualistic and instrumental. It is part of the same reason by the same Hanseatic cities that were smaller, but a bit more so commercially biased. So we can make easily the match between Lübeck and Genoa thanks to this data. And we can observe that in the 50s, the 60s, and the 80s of the 14th century, the value of trade going in and out of the Genoese port basically swings around 1,400,000 florins. Now that's a freaking lot of money, right? And it was spent, militarily speaking, a lot. And Genoa is not even, again, we're talking just about trade, right? This was mostly just a city that, yes, did have a lot of hinterland, but was mostly mountainous. And it was just on the sea, right? Consider states, like major territorial states like the Visconti one, like in part even the same Florence, the same Verona that we've seen recently for the historical region series are something controlling also much more people in the first place and agricultural output and having important industries as well as Genoa had, of course. At the end of the 60s of the 14th century, this balance increased quite sharply, and then by in 1371 it exceeded 2 million gold florins. Right? Comparatively, consider that there were some Italian city-states like Lucca were bought for things like 60,000 florins. Right? So major wars, for example, financed by the papacy in the first half of the 14th century against Milan cost like 1,200,000 florins in all, right, in a couple of years, let's say, of war, of intense warfare. So that tells you how big the thing, and we're talking about armies of 30,000 men, right, which in the Italian case, as I explained countless times, are radically underestimated in the entire medieval warfare, because basically we're the largest ever fielded. Then in 1376-77, the value of Genoese seaborne trade, which was made up most of the, in fact, the Ligurian one, that was hegemonized by Genoa, was still more or less around 2 millions. However, in the early 80s, it was below 1,700,000 gold florins, right? So basically shifting back to the figures of the 50s and the 60s. So there is indeed some sort of decline. Genoa wasn't... I made a video, by the way, about medieval Genoa, again, for the historical region series, so you can check that out if you're interested. It starts being pressured, of course, by Milan, it also seeks the support of the French. So again, it's not just like a completely independent free thing, and you can measure this crisis from this shrinking. But it's still a major naval power, which is also the reason why it also remained fundamentally autonomous. And you know that we discussed in there the Italian maritime republics and the mechanisms and so on. Essentially, the French fleets were Genoese, the Castilian fleets were Genoese, right? So they knew not just with the crossbowmen, but also, in fact, as they were embarked on these fleets, mostly providing probably with entire fleets in a mercenary fashion. They made also a freaking lot of money. But again, we're talking only trade here. So in order to appreciate Lübeck's commercial power, we have to make a slight translation in Italian terms, that is in gold florins. And evidence for the years stretch from 1379 and 1384 show that Lübeck, that had been suffering, by the way, from the mid-14th century crisis, so it actually wasn't faring as well as it had previously done during the last phase of the great full medieval civilization, had a trade of around 350,000 florins, right? So this gives you properly the measure. Also, Genoa was declining, as we've seen, from 2 million to 1,700,000 florins. So the simple maths is that the Genoese trade was essentially 6 to 5 times larger than one of Lübeck, right? And this is, again, just trade. So you can't, it's of course an important part of the wealth that the Republic can draw, but it's not entirely it, right? Economic power is measured also on other bases, influenced by other factors, political stability, social wealth in the first place, that do intertwine with this, but change a bit the equation in terms of what these powers were doing and how. So there is no doubt that the Genoese trade was many times greater than the one of Lübeck. Before the War of Chioggia, the general impression, which I don't think there are exact figures on in this mathematical way, is that the Venetian trade was the same or even inferior to that of Genoa. Interestingly enough, consider these powers, of course, had backs and forths due to, again, all stuff that is not merely economic, and of which economy is just a reflection. So around the same period, again, we see Genoese trade being 5 times as great as Lübeck. And it's shrinking, if you notice, because it passed from 6 to 5, right? So it's gradually reducing compared to the German one, right? Consider this, that aside Genoa, Venice, and Barcelona, in the Mediterranean there was no other port of the same scale. As we've seen recently in the video about Pisa, this city, but also Marseille, Ragusa / Dubrovnik, but even Ancona in the Marches and Aigues-Mortes in Occitania were importantly relevant, right, and also relatively less known, but they all had an important maritime history. For the Baltic, there was literally no other port that could rival with Lübeck's, right? Albeit, even in here, if we look at towns like Danzig, Rostock, and Torun, we realize that there was an important flow as well. If one makes a very wild approximation based on more or less the figures we have about Genoa, Venice, and Barcelona, and also this other lesser Mediterranean centers, we can estimate by the 70s of the 14th century that Mediterranean trade was perhaps 15 times larger than the Baltic one, right? There is, I think, no proper mathematical certainty, but we are pretty sure that by scale, that's a correct assessment, and it's also kind of obvious, all in all. Naturally, again, you have to consider the monopolium that powers like in fact the aforementioned Venice, Genoa, and the Catalans had on the entire trade. Right, other powers like I don't know the Mamluks that were a major power didn't depended fundamentally and historically since ever, like in Egypt, even high medieval times, on trade with Venice. Right, so the as you know, the port citadels were controlled by the Italians, and this also created problems for the local rulers, but it was the only way to access the European markets anyway. So there was really no choice, and this thing went on, right, until the Ottomans, but in part even beyond, as you know, between various truces between Constantinople and Venice. In any case, when we look at this size, it's also evident that there's probably a different culture behind that. For example, the techniques of trading were much less developed in the Baltic than in the Mediterranean. There was essentially a process of catering for many fewer consumers in the north, using much less money, less credit, right? Nobody had topped the kind of wealth accumulation that especially the Italian maritime republics, but through them also other territorial ones like Florence, Milan, had done, and that's why banking develops there. Interestingly enough, among the most important bankers there are continental Tuscans, right, and Lombards that do not actually have an access to the sea. But it doesn't matter because, again, the economy there had no boundary. These were the middle powers that had to also to make the goods passing through Europe. Consider that, as we can see now, in fact, there is a continental trade increase during the late Middle Ages. Because essentially, continental powers in general become more authoritarian and somehow dirigistic. So there is a hard core that manages to also steadily invest in this banking system. I don't know, think about the Fugger at the end of the Middle Ages. They were literally subcontracted. The Italians did the same. In fact, they were the ones, as we will see now, that not just developed accounting, banking in the high and late Middle Ages until basically the modern age. Everything was set on that base, but they all, especially the southern Germans, take from Italy, and through their ever greater involvement in northern Italian affairs, especially these kind of mechanisms as well. The North had, generally speaking, issues such as a general lack of international exchange facility or local giro banking, the lack of insurance syndicates, or the possibility of developing international trading and industrial groups per se, right? I've never made a video specifically about the Hanseatic League and or specifically the German communes. We've seen mostly the Italian ones, of course, but also the French, the Flemish ones. But also the nature of the German ones must be properly assessed, because it's fair to call them towns as opposed to proper cities, just historically, right? They were another thing. These were centers born also relatively recently, and especially these more peripheral ones, right? We've seen this dynamic also in, for example, the Viking era, right? That there are centers that are probably born just with specific strategically commercial purposes, and when the Viking era routes fundamentally change and they literally disappear, and they were to be rediscovered archaeologically. Naturally, in the case of the Hanseatic towns, that's a completely different story, because not just they survive still today, but they are literally also sometimes states within the same German Bundesland, such as Hamburg or Bremen. And that idea of confederal autonomy and identity is I think the strongest in Germany, really, just in the among the Asiatics that are properly like a world on their own, right? They don't even consider themselves anything but themselves, and the Italians do resemble that, but they also build a state that is becoming ever more territorial and regional in scale. So, completely different needs and purposes and scales. However, the Baltic trade centers also were experiencing a development as far as, especially the challenges posed by the literally shift of the same centers of business were concerned. As you know, the Hanseatic League was acting unitarily as far as the mass of the towns made the power of the World League, but internally they were brutally divided and fighting against each other. There were essentially four major chunks that were also supported by this or that power, either from Germany and or, in fact, Scandinavia and other towns of the League. And this ultimately will contribute importantly to the same political, in fact, decline of the League, because, as we were saying before, they were not united enough. But exactly this competition habituated them, in fact, to develop measures to protect wealth better. And this is true also for other German centers who were not part of the Hansa. Right, the Hanseatic League was quite spread. Right, even Naples was part of the Hanseatic League. But the most important banking centers in Germany actually are from the south of the country. We'll see it better in a while. And they did follow, in that case, also an important princely direction, right? That naturally was compacting the conditions for kind of better business locally, as far as this territorial states were emerging, consolidating. So there is continuous region in Europe that encompasses southern Germany, Lombardy, and Tuscany. Right, the latter two are, as we've seen, just by trade, banking, wealth in general, the most powerful. However, there is a crisis, right, part of the broader 14th century, that within Italy, comparatively, affects Tuscany more. Right, for example, the cheap woolen manufacture of Florence and other Tuscan cities starts declining. Right, it is true that there is still an important luxury exports that the Florentines basically start imitating to the perfection, even surpassing in quality the Flemish textiles. But the massive, big, huge trade that had made Florence literally the single richest city in the globe at the time shrinks. Right, even what you see later with the Medici, for example, just derives from the fact that this family, for the first time, had owned as much power in absolute terms, cashing all the other houses of the city. But in absolute terms, considering the whole city, there is nothing in comparison to the whole scale of the early 14th century, right, before the financial cracks. And what was being favored, as we were saying before, was Lombardy and her cities in the process, because they're just becoming the center of a more stable territorial state that even threatens, invades Tuscany, that had been somewhat just financially hegemonized by Florence, because Florence, again, even if it was the richest city in the world, hadn't managed to subdue Tuscany right, at this point, and stressed mostly a sort of confederal, this sphere of influence, right, by simply cashing financially the smaller communes in Tuscany and just episodically launching, mounting up important conquest campaigns of entire cities. Unlike Milan, that had whose lordship has basically specialized in this systematic and ruthless subjugation of any other center. Right? When you speak of Milan now, it's factually the entire Lombardy, at least. Right? All the cities there depend on her, and also the surrounding areas are basically under the Milanese control. Other centers had declined disastrously. For example, Lucca, right, where silk cloth production had been very important, but it starts diminishing together with the broader political, demographic crisis of the city that passes under different lordships. We can make a video about Lucca. And at the same time, Venice and Bologna are increasing in power. Venice, due to the ultimately victorious struggle against Genoa, and the fact that, as we were saying before, since the end of the 13th century had, thanks to the so-called law of the Major Council, structured much more solidly her political institutional system that acted in a much more unitary way. And so even if Genoa was as commercially powerful as her, she managed to win anyway, right? Even having been risk being knocked out by the same Genoese invasion. Bologna enjoys this important wealth because most of the Milanese expansion routes are towards Tuscany, because it was just richer in general. But Bologna was a very important city in the largest city in Emilia at the time. There weren't essentially other bigger powers, especially cities, around her. And she also flirted with Milan for that matter, because she could enjoy a bit more of a decentralized position. And so she increases capitalizing on this. So you see essentially a Tuscan crisis and an economy that remain, they remain very, very active, dynamic places economically and all. It's just that the center of these powers starts shifting towards the north, the northeast. It's mostly a manufacturing crisis. When you look at even the same products, were mostly fustians, maiolica, paper, soap, and glass. Well, these were essentially all developing north of the Apennines. And the production of armor there was historically not just dramatically advanced, but dramatically expanding at the same time, right? For Milan, for Brescia, you can't speak literally of industries, right? The 14th century, 15th century European armor is fundamentally Italian armor, right? Milanese armor, specifically so-called, at least. And it has an incredibly organized business model that will remain dominant even later on during the Spanish period. Milanese industry keeps producing, and so on. So it's just a huge win. Also, glass making, really important industries. Venice was benefiting from this because, by geographical proximity being the principal seaport for the area, she was flourishing a bit like by influence, while the Genoese trade that was traditionally based on the export of Tuscan goods was in crisis, right? So it's not surprising that cities like Milan and Venice during this time even managed to grow demographically through immigration, essentially, right? And also an important degree of merchant ones. Think about the Fondaco of the Germans at the same point, exactly because of the opening of the Bavarian route with Venice. And they would, in spite of the plague, in spite of the important waves that affected cyclically Europe, of the fact the black bubonic one that had spread since 1347-48. It's important to stress, we've seen it for Poland during the 14th century as well, that some areas of Europe were spared, apparently by at least the most devastating effects of the plague, and one of this was, incredibly enough, considering the international interconnection, Milan. And do not underestimate this in terms of, again, demographically, economically. And so the fact that for a pre-industrial system, just not having suffered that important hemorrhage of men and production was a major changer, right? The fact that Poland consolidates so much at this point is also part of that, and there are other centers also in Belgium that undergo the same process. So this could mean a lot. Florence instead is dramatically struck, right? Florentine population seems to have halved between 1340s and the beginning of the 15th century, which is a lot, really. And you understand the crisis there too. Equally, cities like Siena and Perugia, the latter which again I discussed incidentally a couple of weeks ago, suffered too, because they somehow were, especially the first one, but also the latter politically, depending on Florence, right? They were both sees important banking activities historically, and so the Florentine crisis dragged them down too, right? So this era, especially of southern Tuscany, starts properly deindustrializing compared to what it had been doing before. Conversely, what we see is that southern Germany increases in power, right? And part of the reason is, of course, her dependency on Lombardy. And this dramatic urban belt and the Alpine traffics with it, right? Southern Germany, as we explained, was historically richer, more developed, had already, as we've seen, been connected with Italy for obvious reasons, and this growth would go on importantly for a couple of hundred years. It was the southern German merchants, not the North German ones, that were taking up probably the Italian-made commercial methods, accumulating cheap capital, and developing their own international commercial mining manufacturing enterprises. So investing, as we were explaining before, also properly in infrastructure, subcontracting on behalf of the local princes. There were important mines in southern Germany, in Bavaria, and these were important for the same Italian economy. They were moving on, essentially from importing goods from Italy for distribution, simply as that, and manufacturing substitutes for at least some of them, and especially fustians, paper, and armor, right? In fact, all these fields, like, that the German armor at the very end of the Middle Ages is the second most important in Europe after the Milanese one, right? The so-called Gothic one. I made a video about also book production, and that it was Gutenberg that invented the press. So paper making had mostly come from the tour from China about Talas River, allegedly through the Arab world in Spain, and then from there the Italian and other Western scholars brought it in their country, and Italy, and especially the area of the Marches, had specialized in paper production, as it still does today. And very high standards from there began to spread further north. um, significantly, none of the aforementioned products any longer appear among the range of goods sent over the Alps in 1392 by one of the most important firms of 14th century Nuremberg, that is the Kress family. So the Kress accounts are very important because lacking like a more comprehensive systemic structural evidence, they, however, tell us what could an average southern German firm could do at this point. Especially the accounts of Hilpold Kress, who was responsible for the firm's business in Venice, as you understand, are crucial here. There were lots of Germans in Venice, as we were saying before. Thanks to these traffics, the ever greater Venetian interest in the Italian mainland, trying to secure the various routes, the Alpine passes with Bavaria, etc. And if we look at Hilpold's accounts, we see that rolls of cloth formed the most important group of goods sent from Venice to Nuremberg, right? In 1 year, 101, mainly of silk, appeared in Hilpold's accounts. Of various quality, of course. We can see the cheap Pasthart, which costs only 3.5 florins the roll, right, up to actually the priciest, right, a single roll of rich blue velvet, right, that cost not less than 40 florins. Comparatively, a Florentine textile laborer during the same years took 2 years of wage to get such a sum. Right? That tells you how luxury that was. Only one, but still importantly present in the account. Most of the cloth, however, of course, fell into a more middle range, such as brocades at 10 or 14 florins a roll, taffetas at 7.25 florins each. These were still kind of luxury products. Late medieval Europe mostly keeps up with luxury exports, right? What is fascinating, we've seen it in other medieval economy videos, is that albeit things are going worse for the average person from the mid-14th century crisis, actually trade flow doesn't quite contract significantly, and actually, especially the luxury stuff increases because the elites were becoming ever more elite, right? And the whole political and social system was sclerotizing towards the Renaissance. As what we call the Ancien regime, hardly anything like, say, humanistic or republican, as a certain historiography wants to stress that, with the Renaissance, people acquire more importance. Not at all, right? Nowhere in Europe, as a matter of fact. Quite the contrary, actually. So this stuff, again, was not as luxurious as the velvet, but still, as an average, cloth was still luxury. Most of these clothes were woven in northern Italy. However, others came from much more distant places, right? We are on the eve of Timur-Lane Empire. Some clothes imported by the Italians were produced in Damascus or Baghdad, some even as far as Samarkand, right? And this was obvious because the Italians controlled all the Levant ports, as we've seen, and so all the stuff from the Silk Road that had somehow, shrank in flow after the collapse during, in fact, the 14th century of the Universal Mongol Empire, and the fragmentation again had changed the things, but still, right, the Silk Road was active at any time, right, in the Middle Ages, and quite actively so. So if we look at Hilpold Kress, 101 rolls in this account, we see that altogether they cost 1,075 florins. Then there were other products such as the spices that cost 880 ducats altogether, and nearly half of this spice was Indian pepper, remarkably enough. And that also tells you how, of course, spices were some of the most lucrative products at the time. They were quite important for preserving food and etc., and also kind of, in fact, luxury products. The third most important commodity in kind imported by Cres from Venice was pearls, so other luxury product. They were no less than 257 ounces altogether, and the value was from 5 shillings to 17 the ounce per se. There is no total for the pearls, but considering from these figures, in absolute terms, they must have been worth as much as the spices altogether, right? And may have even surpassed, importantly, in fact, the total value of cloth, depending, of course, on how many ounces of each quality were in total, which is like an unknown factor, which can't make the value float, as you understand it. That's very often how we study history of economics. We don't know, like for most other things, historical in general. Then, aside from essentially silk, as we've seen, spices and pearls, there were other commodities. Loaves of sugar coming from plantations in Sicily, or in Crete, or other places in the Eastern Mediterranean that mostly were, in that case, in the latter case, latter two cases in Crete, in the Aegean and the Levant, had been refined in Venice, that imported it from there. Then bales of raw Syrian cotton, barrels of soap. The latter must have been the bottom limit of value of commodities, which was probably worth transporting over such a long distance via land that, as you know, was way more problematic than via sea. That is essentially from Venice through the Brenner Pass, so the Alps, up to Nuremberg, having crossed the entire Bavaria, arriving in Franconia practically. This is also an interesting consideration. Of course, the aforementioned luxury exports must take into account that cheaper commodities, of course, were also, like, why would you have exported them unless they could be disposed of in such great abundance trans-regionally? It was the case, as we've seen, of the Central and Eastern European grain, for example, out to, I don't know, the Iberian Peninsula. It starts happening at this point. And that the answer was also involved in, as you understand. The wall of the Cres accounts values speaks of 2 ducats per 100 pounds. So, as we know from the Hiltpold's Cres accounts, 2 ducats per 100 pounds was mostly the average. The whole half ton that Cres imported in that case was worth far less than a single roll of blue velvet, comparatively. What did, however, Cres export from Nuremberg, and of course other places where those goods were gathered from his business? Well, 3,600 florins worth of silver from the aforementioned mines that you remember were subcontracted, and roughly 2/3 were exported in ingots, while 1/3 was worked up by silversmiths in Nuremberg. What strikes about the latter aspect from the value is that skilled craftsmanship was dramatically cheap, as the silver plate was only valued some 8% more than the raw bar of silver. So you even wonder, who was actually working them. Differently, the value of gold sent to Venice by this route appears to be small. There was only just over 500 florins worth of it, and given that almost 140 florins worth of gold was actually brought from Venice to Nuremberg, you realize that the net value of it was not very great at all. The only other meaningful commodity that Cress sent to Venice is Baltic amber, that naturally followed the same path it had been following since ever. Like it's the Bronze Age, from the Baltic to essentially northeastern Italy. Yet at this point, amber naturally was not particularly valuable, right? It was almost worth just the sugar sent from Venice, as we've seen through the Mediterranean exports. So when you look at it in a raw way, you realize that Cress's trade with Venice consisted almost exclusively of silver and silver plate to Venice, and primarily silks, spices, and pearls to Germany, right? And the southern Germans were also beginning to produce many other luxury goods locally by themselves, and that's part of the gradual affirmation that these German businesses are carrying out also in the international arena, and that was also importantly influenced by the Lombard cities in South Germany, and then eventually in the late Middle Ages we would see the increase in importance of Antwerp. That would be at the base even of the future United Provinces, then England, right? But consider that the Italian per capita wealth was uninterruptedly the highest in the world since Roman times, even during the early Middle Ages until the late 17th century, when in fact the Netherlands and England surpassed it for the first time thanks to the colonial business, etc. And we've seen this incidentally in a video about the 17th century Venetian fleet, when lots of Dutch and English ships are being contracted by the Venetian navy, as essentially these navies were entering the Mediterranean, starting to dominate themselves on the longer run. And naturally this has nothing to do with the second half of the 14th century, but we will see it, as we have already done, in another video. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.